Hi there, my name is Paul Thorne and welcome to the second edition of my podcast, COVID-19 Surviving in Isolation. Wanted to talk a little bit about just some fundamental stuff really, things to consider if you're isolating at home. If you listened to my podcast last time, which was about fear, you'll know that was an introduction to myself and basically what qualifies me to speak about this. Just go over briefly again. I was isolated for 3 months in negative pressure isolation after contracting a rare multi-drug resistant strain of tuberculosis. And basically, that's where this experience come from. I've done a lot of writing actually, and it's formed the basis of a lot of my work. So in these challenging times, I just really wanted to try and repurpose some of what I've done in the past, in the hope that maybe it will help some of you that choose to listen to this podcast if you're self-isolating at home. Yeah, isolation, it can be a very difficult and emotional time, and COVID-19 is socially transmitted. When somebody's found to be infectious with COVID-19, they'll need to be isolated and manage the symptoms if they have them, maybe asymptomatic. And the purpose is to prevent further transmission to other people. Generally, after 7 days, you shouldn't be infectious anymore. If you're self-isolating with a family, then you'll need to self-isolate for 14 days. Anyway, that's the current advice of the UK government. If you're listening and you're in another country, you need to check what the rules are there. So isolating, whether you're self-isolating or in a hospital or other facility, it is an effective method of infection control. And it contrasts with the earlier methods with tuberculosis, really. They were sent to the old TB sanatoriums, and people lived together, sometimes for years, in very well ventilated rooms. Indeed, the veranda, which is architecturally an American idea, really comes from tuberculosis. It's so people could sit outside together. And very often these TB sanatoriums were in beautiful surroundings. They were next to the mountains or side of a lake, and plenty of fresh air was the order of the day. And on appearances, it looked a bit more like a holiday than a stay in a hospital. But times have changed. Isolation means just that, and it means staying at home. I can recommend a really good book actually by a woman called Betty MacDonald. It was published in 1948. It's an old book, but it's incredibly funny. It's called A Plague and I. Highly recommend it if you can find a copy. I think it has been reprinted, so you should be able to maybe find a second-hand copy on Amazon or something. Incredibly funny book, and if you're isolating right now, you will certainly identify with it. When I was a kid, we went on a holiday to Scotland and went to a place called Girvan, and off the coast of Girvan there's a plug of an old volcano called Elsa Craig, and Elsa Craig is basically a rock in the sea, and it's quite a big rock and has a lot of birds living on it, and we took a boat trip over there, and it took about an hour and a half to get there actually on the boat. I remember everybody being incredibly sick and very glad to step off of that boat onto this very rocky beach. And there was a couple of old buildings which were derelict, and I thought at the time how wonderful it would be to live on Elsa Craig. I was a bit of a funny kid, I liked the idea of had this romantic idea of being a writer in solitude and all the rest of it. And I think it has changed hands a couple of times. And actually maybe people do live on it now. But not for me today. I think what I have learned is that there's a romanticism, I guess, behind it that I'm trying to illustrate. There was a writer from the Washington Post. Her name's Jean-Marie Lascas, and she had a quote which actually used in my book Tuberculosis Survival Handbook. Just really resonated with me, and it kind of illustrates that romanticism that I'm talking about. But she says, isolation is aloneness that feels forced upon you like a punishment. Solitude is aloneness you choose and embrace. Great things can come out of solitude, out of going to a place where all is quiet except for the beating of your heart. What that says to me is isolation is really about a mindset as to how we feel. And isolation brings with it is a load of coping problems. There's little written about the subject, certainly in relation to tuberculosis and the psychological effects when you're isolated. But there are studies of people being placed in isolation following a bone marrow transplant. And isolation is necessary in this case whilst the transplant, for want of a better word, is taking during this time. The patients are at risk from a variety of infections, and this is because their immune systems have been artificially suppressed to prevent rejection of the transplant. So the big difference is that isolated people with bone marrow transplants, they're there to prevent them from being infected rather than to prevent them from infecting others. I guess we're doing both at the same time. Some of us will have COVID-19, some of us won't. But in considering a 14 to 30 day period in isolation, there was one study that found that patients suffered with depression, anxiety, disorientation. Some patients complained of difficulty in concentrating. They experienced odd sleeping patterns. I know for sure I'm having a load of very weird dreams at the moment. A general feeling of loss of control, which, kind of caused mood swings. So there are many similarities between both experiences of isolation. I guess the major difference is like I said, a bone marrow transplant is planned. People have some time to prepare themselves before they go into isolation. I guess we've kind of had a heads up, but COVID-19 has pretty much come out of the blue, and we're all having to try and find our way. What this study does say is that patients' concerns are health, family, marital attitudes, financial worries, sexual and social activities, their job, and just general daily life. Self-image as well. And many people describe the experience of being in a state of limbo or going stir-crazy. The report recommends that people make structures for themselves, routine if you like, in 15 minutes blocks of time, requiring them, do their own bathing, formally schedule a time for watching television, making phone calls, exercising, resting. And the authors also encourage people to bring in computers and other items from home if they're in hospital that may increase their comfort and help them to occupy and structure their days. Well, I guess most of us are actually isolating at home, so we're going to have all of those things to hand. In future podcasts, I'm going to cover some of those things: health, family, marital attitudes, financial worries, job and daily life. I'll probably leave the sexual thing to you to deal with. I'm no one to lecture anybody on that. But I'll cover some of those things in future podcasts. I guess the real thing that comes across from this study is how important routine and structure are. And I for one, make it a rule that when I get up and I get dressed. Get showered and dressed and ready to start my day. There are a few other things I do in the morning as well. I take some medication, and I also do the washing up, and I make a plan for my day. I make a list. I'm a big list person. One of the things I probably am not doing enough of is exercise, and this is something I will try and cover in a future podcast, but I've got to get my head around it myself, but let's see what happens. One of the things I really want to focus on in this podcast are the psychological issues that people deal with during the isolation experience. There's no doubt that it does affect people, and it can be in very subtle ways. I guess if you're living with a family as well, and particularly if you don't get on with some of the people in the family, can be fractious, to say the least, and there may be other problems at home as well that rear their heads. It must be incredibly difficult, and I guess for me it's easier in that respect because I'm living on my own, but I do miss social contact with other people. And for all this talk of, yes, let's use the technology, let's work from home, let's use FaceTime, let's use Skype, let's use Zoom, it's not the same. And however much people are saying how great it is, it's not the same. And I'm really missing my local pub at the moment, I have to say. It's a social activity that I enjoy maybe 3 or 4 times a week, and missing that big time. So I guess it's a double-edged sword. The issues that you're facing if you're on your own are going to be different than if you're actually with family members, particularly if you don't get on with some of them. In terms of my own isolation, I was isolated for 3 months, and it was one of the most difficult times and experiences I've had in my entire life. Hopefully the isolation period for people with COVID-19 will be short. I guess we don't know how long we're going to be socially isolating, and we can still pop out and go to the shops and buy essentials and get our bout of exercise every day. But for many people, this whole experience of isolation will be the worst aspect of the disease, even if they don't get it, perhaps. My suggestion to you is that you structure your time, create a routine. Also, if you're isolating at home, ensure that people respect your privacy. You may all be in the same house, but maybe you want some time away from people. Completely understandable. For me, one of the main things that I found very useful was to keep a diary, a journal of my days. And it's worth noting that there are a lot of famous writers in the past who had TB. And I know I keep going back to the TB thing, but it's where I'm getting my source of, it's my point of reference. So please excuse me. I'm just trying to repurpose what I've done before on TB for COVID-19. But I think that actually there may be, some people that actually start writing, and perhaps you could be one of them if you've always wanted to write a book. Maybe the time is now. If you thought you didn't have the time. So I've gone over just some key fundamentals about isolation. In future podcasts, I will get down to nitty gritty and speak about some specific aspects of our lives and how we can better manage them. I hope that you found this podcast useful. I'm enjoying making them. If you want to find the other podcasts, there are links available on my website, which is survivingisolation.com. And if you want to find out more about my book, Diary of a Modern Consumptive, it's available as an ebook, an audiobook, and also in print. You can find details of that on Amazon. So anyway, until next week, I'll leave it there and I wish you well.